Welcome to our free webinar. This is going to be covering Arc Flash versus NFPA 70E training. So a lot of people out there talk about needing Arc Flash training. And yes, you do need that, but there's actually more to it. And so we're going to break down, what actually 70E says is required. And if somebody says, hey, we do Arc Flash training, what they typically are covering versus what should be covered for full electrical safety training. My name is Caitlyn Wininger, and I'm an electrical engineer here at Herzig Engineering, and I'm a certified electrical safety compliance professional. Basically, NFPA has this certification that says I've got my degree, I've got work experience, I've gone through different trainings, and I've specialized in this field, and then I took a test and they said, yep, she knows what she's talking about for 70E. So if you have any questions, by all means, let me know through that question feature or chat box, and I will get them answered as soon as possible. I will be monitoring that throughout this presentation today. So first up, I've got a couple polls. And I just want to kind of get to know how you guys approach your training currently. So this first one, I'm going to go ahead and launch it. It's asking, what training format does your workplace provide for electrical safety? So in other words, what is the format of that training? Is it online and videos? Is it a live training? Is it in person? Or maybe you just haven't done any yet. So go ahead and click on your response and click the submit button, and then you should be able to submit your answer. There's a lot of ways to approach electrical safety training, and I'm not gonna say necessarily any one thing is better than the other, depending on your situation, but it is interesting to see how it's being implemented currently. A lot of video, a lot of online, okay, some in person for sure. Pretty good split currently. About 60% of you have voted so far or submitted your response. Very good. Give it just another couple seconds and then we'll go ahead and close it out. Okay, so just to show you what the results were, we had 38% say that they use videos or online trainings, which can be super convenient. You can go back and look at it anytime you need to. If you've got a lot of turnover, that really helps with the onboarding process, getting them tackled as well, or not tackled, taken care of. 13% said live webinars, so it's online training like this, but it's a live session. 25% in person, and 25% said that they just simply haven't done it yet. All right. Good to know, good to know. Another real quick poll for you. For those of you who have done your training before, would you consider it to be Arc Flash training, or is it electrical safety training, covering all the relevant topics in NFPA 70E? And that is really what we're going to be diving into today. So is it Arc Flash training, full 70E training, or you're just not sure, or maybe you don't have it yet? Depending on how you go about training can make a big difference for how you view this as well. So if it's really, really heavily focused on Arc Flash and you feel like you really haven't covered anything else, Arc Flash is a required topic, but it's something to consider expanding. If you think you have full 70E training, well, we're going to look at some of that as well today. And for those of you saying not sure or that it's not provided yet, no worries, we will cover that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll out. And actually, 56% of you say that it is actually 70E training or electrical safety training, not just Arc Flash. And then 33% say it's Arc Flash training, which again, very common. There's been a big push, especially in recent years, to get electrical safety training to cover Arc Flash training and those hazards more thoroughly. So a lot of training content has been geared towards that in recent years. Okay, so we're going to start off just going through what does 70E actually say for Arc Flash versus electrical safety trainings. Okay, and then we'll get into comparing what those topics typically look like, the type of courses to look for, and how to audit what training you currently provide or have taken to make sure that it is complete and compliant and getting covered what needs to be covered. So starting off, we're going to talk about the NFPA 70E and ARC Flash requirements. The NFPA 70E is the standard for electrical safety in the workplace. It is to provide a practical, safe working area for employees relative to the hazards arising from the use of electricity, which is a long-winded way of saying it tells you how to work on electrical equipment safely. Who can do it? How do you determine if they're qualified? All those wonderful things. Again, it is the consensus standard for electrical safety. It's not new. It's been around since 1979. And OSHA, in a letter of interpretation, even said, from a standards perspective, OSHA views NFPA 70E as the primary consensus standard addressing electrical hazards associated with electrical utilization systems. So even keeping the lights on and this computer running right here, it's electrical utilization. The panels and the disconnects and the transformers and everything that feed this equipment need to be addressed through an arc flash study. So if there's a potential for an arc flash hazard, you do have to have an arc flash study. That is required. Anything likely to require examination, adjustment, servicing, or maintenance while energized is required to be labeled with the voltage information. Again, shock hazard is still very prevalent. We're going to get into that. The arc flash boundary, how far out can this hazard hurt people, and how are you going to protect yourself within those boundaries? Now, knowing those three key elements for arc flash hazards and shock hazards is going to drastically simplify your electrical safety training, because if you know what the hazard levels are, it takes out a lot of the guesswork and the discussion and debate about, well, what do we do then? It'll tell you right there. It'll show you how to protect yourself and others with those boundaries and protection requirements, the PPE, the incident energy, things like that. Okay, so they go hand in hand. You know, just having an arc flash study done doesn't protect workers. They have to be able to use it appropriately, which is where the training comes in. So in the 70E, it talks about the employer's responsibility. Having a safety program is step number one. Know the NFPA 70E and create an electrical safety policy, plan, procedures, work practices, the whole 9 yards that comply with the program and fit your workplace. Okay, so that's kind of two separate initiatives there sometimes that then have to be merged. Then provide employees with training over those safety-related work practices and procedures. Okay, so training is required as part of the employer's responsibility so that the employee can perform their part, complying with those safety-related work practices and procedures. Kind of hard to comply with something if you've never been trained on it, right? So jumping right into Article 110.4 in the 2024 NFPA 70E, it talks about the training requirements. And 110.4A is the electrical safety training requirements. And there is a whole bunch of information in there. I am definitely not going to read the 70E to you today, but I am going to pick out specific highlights and try to summarize as best as possible so that we don't spend the next 2 to 3 hours diving into this. It's a 30-minute webinar, right? So first up, the training requirements do apply to any employee that's exposed to electrical hazards. Not just qualified workers, not just electricians or HVAC crews or maintenance techs. It could even be operators. If they have to do simple tasks that could put them exposed to electrical hazards at any point, and remind you, 50 volts and greater, 50 volts or greater. So, general facility maintenance techs, things like that, need to be trained on how to identify those hazards and what boundaries and work practices and procedural requirements there are associated with their respective job or tasks. How can they be protected from those hazards they're exposed to specifically? And understand what happens if they're not protected. So how can electrical hazards result in injury or possibly even a fatality? That needs to be covered at a high level for any worker in the facility. Now, for qualified persons specifically, we look at 110.4A1, qualified persons. They also need to be trained and knowledgeable in the equipment that they are going to be working on. So if it's relevant to their job or their task, they need to know what they're working on. Great, that's almost more of an NEC type training or a apprenticeship or a skills-based training, right? So it's a little different than just safety, but arguably, if you don't know what you're working on, you probably can't work on it safely, right? You also need to make sure that qualified personnel know the applicable techniques, precautionary techniques, policies, procedures, PPE, anything else that they might need to do the job safely. Now, those are listed and described later in 70E. How to determine PPE, what rating on your tools and test instruments do you need, how do you set up boundaries to warn and caution people of these hazards, things like that. That's going to be later on in the standard. You also have to make sure that each person is qualified and trained over their specific tasks. So there's a lot of training that you can do as just across the board. Like everyone on the maintenance team has to take this training, but then maybe the electricians have to take an additional level of electrical safety training. And then, unqualified personnel, maybe they have an abbreviated version of that overall training. And then management has to take another training because they have to supervise it and make sure that it's being done appropriately. So whatever you're qualified or supposed to be qualified to work on and or do, the tasks that you're performing regarding electrical safety, then there should be training appropriate for that level of exposure. Qualified persons that are allowed to be in those hazard boundaries also have to know the difference between exposed, energized electrical conductors or circuit parts and other parts of the equipment. For example, not all components in an electrical enclosure should be current carrying. So can you identify that? How do you know the nominal voltage of equipment? If it's labeled, it makes it a little easier, but if it's not, how do you determine that? What are the approach distances for those boundaries, for those voltages? Knowing what the limited approach means versus the restricted approach. Limited approach being that everyone else has to stay back a minimum so many inches or feet, depending on the voltage. Most of the time it's 3.5 feet for low voltage. And then within the restricted approach boundary, you have to have your shock protection on, and there's other additional paperwork things and all that going on. Okay, what are those boundaries? And what all that means needs to be covered in that training. They also need to be trained on how to perform decision-making processes necessary to perform job safety plans, identify hazards, assess the risk, likelihood of it going wrong, and severity if it did, that's risk together, and select the right risk control methods, including personal protective equipment, but that is by no means the only thing. Right? So as a qualified person, they're going to need to be trained and knowledgeable on how to identify when PPE is needed, but what other risk control methods can be used in addition to PPE during those tasks. Because if you think about it, that's the bottom of the hierarchy of controls. It's the least effective, it's got the most points of potential failure, it requires on a lot of human performance issues there, right? So there's a large chance for error compared to engineering it out, for example. Okay, so A1D is just talking about how if you're still in training, you haven't been considered qualified yet, maybe you're not totally good to go, signed off on everything, you need to make sure that those people are demonstrating what they can do, and they can get qualified little by little for specific tasks and specific duties. So it's not necessarily an all or nothing kind of situation. So if they're still undergoing training, then just make sure that they're demonstrating their knowledge before being released to do something themselves. A big part of training, and that's why it's got its own bullet point here, is verification of absence of voltage. They have to be trained on the steps to actually establish an electrically safe work condition. It is an 8-step process. I would argue like 10 steps. If you went through my training, you would know that some of those steps have hidden steps within them because, oh yeah, you have to stop and put on your PPE before you do this step because there's exposed electrical conductors or circuit parts. And oh yeah, before you do this, you also have to fill out a job safety plan because you're definitely going to be exposed to electrical conductors or circuit parts. There's additional steps. Point is verification of absence of voltage, that live, dead, live check, known, dead, known source with your meter. That's a very, very key part of electrical safety training. And then in training requirements to confirm that actually it's being followed and it's understood and that training was sufficient for the worker, there does need to be regular supervision and inspections, at least on an annual basis. This is where we typically talk about those annual field audits, but more common checkpoints, the better. The more frequent you can check in on people, the better. Again, just to make sure that that training actually stuck. It made sense, it's applicable, it worked. Then there's the unqualified persons. So like I said, it's not just about the electrical workers, the ones getting in, with their gloves on and their meters, and it could also just be people in the general vicinity. So unqualified persons shall also be trained in and familiar with any safety-related practices necessary for their safety. At a bare minimum, I recommend teaching them what to look for as far as what's exposed versus not, so they can know if it's even safe to enter an area. And then if they see someone dressed up in PPE, depending on the elements they're wearing, I can talk through how far back they have to stay. Preferably, a qualified person is going to have their boundary set up, right? But sometimes it's best to just go ahead and let everyone know, hey, based on this level of exposure, this level of a hazard, here's how far back it could still hurt you. So either whenever they see that boundary set up, they respect it, or if for some reason it wasn't set up, they still know how far back to stay to keep themselves and others safe. So at a minimum, I always like to talk about that, and of course, how it could hurt them if they don't pay attention to that. There's a lot of other topics too, depending on what unqualified person this is. For example, those who are authorized to perform lockout tagout are not automatically qualified to do electrical work. So sometimes you'll have people doing lockout tagout tasks, and then as part of their job, they're going to have to get into something that could have electrical components. Well, they need to know to stop and ask for a qualified person to do that absence of voltage check, to do the verification of absence of voltage, and then they're also going to be involved in that lockout tagout process now, rather than making any assumptions, because, you know what they say about the word assume, makes you look silly, so let's not do that, right? So training those unqualified persons, they're not electrical workers, they're not doing tasks on anything 50 volts or greater, but they still could be exposed. Let's make sure they're trained too. Now, additional training and retraining over all of these things need to happen at a minimum of every 3 years. That's a minimum. And let's be honest, do you remember everything after 3 years? If you've been through a training one time and then nobody talks about it again, and then 3 years later you're asked to recap what you know, it's probably not going to be very much unless you put it to practice every single day and you're doing your own study to it. But by and large, let's just be real. You're not going to remember much. So I recommend every year going through this training to some extent or another. It could be an abbreviated, could be long, I don't know, whatever you need to do, but it's better than every 3 years. Even better is if you can break it out into bite-sized pieces and do frequent reminders every month, right? So, safety meetings once a month, make sure you talk about the highlights and the most important things you're seeing in your workplace for electrical safety. Some additional training and retraining should also be done if someone is not doing it right. Maybe they're skipping steps. Maybe they don't clearly understand what they're supposed to be doing. Maybe there's new equipment or new technology or new safety procedures. If it's something that they don't do very often, especially less than once a year, definitely going to need to review that task and how to do it safely before you just say, go do it, right? And if it's going to be a new or different work practice than normally used by the employee during regular job duties. Or if the job duties change, so they're exposed to something different or working on different equipment or have a higher level of hazard or risk due to that new task. Now, how do you approach that training? A lot of people do online training, which is considered classroom-based training. There's also on-the-job training, and it says that it can be either or a combination of the two, and this always gets people. The type and extent of the training provided shall be determined by the risk to the employee. So it's up to you. You have to make a judgment call. What do they need? What will work to get these safe work practices in their brain and become a habit in their daily workplace? I always recommend a combination of both. Online or in-person training is great in a classroom setting, but then let's do some hands-on. Let's take it on the job, practice setting up the boundaries, practice verifying absence of voltage, and that way it sets in a little bit easier, lasts a little bit longer. The retention rates tend to be longer if you do a combination of the two. Because also on the job side, maybe you can get so caught up in how to do the job whenever you're doing on-the-job training, that you forget to cover the why. It is required. Here's why it's required. And those kind of details are easier to go through and really digest in the classroom, just from my own experience. And then of course you have to document that training, make sure that you retain it for the duration of that employee's employment, and that documentation is going to be what was covered, the name, and when you did it, okay? Now, additional training, not just electrical safety, but let's talk about lockout tagout very, very briefly. You do have to have lockout tagout training, and it makes sense. If you're going to teach somebody how to verify absence of voltage, establish an electrically safe work condition, one of those steps is lockout tagout. So let's make sure that the LOTO training is appropriate. This is also at intervals not to exceed 3 years, or if other things prompt it to be done more frequently, procedures revised, or someone's not doing it right, go ahead and retrain on that as well. Similar kind of documentation requirements for that. One piece that is actually every year rather than 3 years is contact release training. So contact release training means someone's locked on or hung up on a circuit. You got to make sure that people know how to remove that victim without also getting themselves hurt or killed. Because touching that person who's currently getting shocked is sometimes just like touching the conductor directly. So whenever you see someone locked on or hung up, what policy do you have in place? What emergency action plan do you have in place? And are the appropriate people trained on that? You know, if you have a buddy system or an attendant policy, is that buddy, is that attendant trained on contact release? What does that mean? How do you do it? What are the best steps? What do you have on hand? Going through all those things, I like to practice it too, especially with more willing participants that actually will hold on to something and make you break that grip, because guys, it's harder than it looks, I can tell you. You're gonna have to put your full body weight into it. And that takes me on a tangent thinking about, you know, how you assign buddies and who's going to actually be able to rescue who, but all of that should be thought out ahead of time and trained on annually. There's other kinds of training for emergency response as well. It's highly recommended across the board CPR, AED, first aid training, and it is required for anyone who has been designated as responsible for responding to medical emergencies, okay? So, you know, if it's an electrician, yeah, they're not going to perform CPR on themselves, but if they ever find themselves in a situation where they're the buddy, then this is training that needs to be done. The verification of all these trainings should be done annually, just to make sure that the documentation's up to date and that, you know, the 3-year versus the 1-year rule is being covered for everybody for all the different topics. Okay, so that was a very, very quick rundown of what the 70E says is required for training. I will note, again, I did not read and I skimmed through a lot of that material. There is a handouts tab in GoToWebinar that you can download the presentation, and that way you can go back and reference it and read through it. It comes from the NFPA 70E, so if you have a copy of that, you can always just reference that as well. So whenever I talk about 70E training versus just arc flash training, hopefully you're already starting to see what I mean by that and why that's such a big deal. So what is typical arc flash training focused on? Well, comes a lot of times with arc flash studies. If you have a study done, you know, you got to be able to read and interpret those blocks of information on the warning labels or danger labels. You know, what is the incident energy analysis? What does the working distance mean? What is the arc flash boundary? What are the shock boundaries? How do those apply? What PPE is required for the different levels of hazard? All that information should be adequately covered in arc flash training and in 70E training, right? If they're going to have to be able to use those labels to protect themselves, to identify their hazards and to protect themselves accordingly, you got to train over it. I only have like 5-6 minutes left, but a little tangent here. I cannot tell you the number of times at this point that I have gone on site to do an audit or training or some other kind of service, and I see the labels and I'm talking to workers and I asked, how many of you seen these labels on your equipment? And I know they're there. And some of them will raise their hand, some of them won't, or you know, some of them will say, oh yeah, I see those all over the place, and some of them go, I'm not totally sure, I haven't been looking for them. Okay. So for the group who weren't sure or hadn't been looking for them, I make sure that they know, look for them, right? And for the group who has said, yeah, I've seen them around, I ask, when was the last time you read one? And then I get deer in the headlights, scratching of the head, looking all around like, have you read one? Because I haven't read one. These labels are totally useless if people don't actually know how to read and use the information. So yes, ARC Flash training should absolutely go over those labels and how to use them thoroughly. And those boundaries are a big part of it, because those boundaries determine when you need PPE and when other people need to stay back. And that's whenever it's exposed. And then you have to think about, well, what does it mean exposed? Could I become exposed? Is it physically exposed already? There's all these little tangents and rabbit holes that you can go down in ARC Flash training. Most of the time, though, it'll stop at saying there's a boundary. When you cross the boundary, you have to be protected. And then maybe it'll even go into, well, what does that protection look like? Breaking down the different levels and how to inspect your PPE, look at the rating, wash it properly if they're really getting into it, right? That's great information to know, but don't stop there. There's also shock hazards. I can't tell you, again, the number of times that I have seen people talking about insulated gloves and leather protectors as part of the ARC Flash PPE. Now, they do provide ARC Flash protection, but those insulated gloves are for your shock protection primarily. Okay, so let's make sure we're clear. Even if there's not an ARC Flash hazard, you could still have a shock hazard. You gotta have your insulated gloves with protectors on regardless. So, very good to have ARC Flash hazards addressed. Don't get me wrong, it's never a bad idea, even just to do refresher trainings like this toolbox talk that we put together. Okay, so on our website, herzigengineering.com/labels, it's less than 15 minutes long. It goes through a poster that you can download and explains, what are the levels of PPE and how do you make sure you're establishing your boundaries correctly, and when does this even apply? How do you read the label? So it goes through all that information. It takes less than 15 minutes. That's great. Use it. Take it, use it, run with it. Just don't call that good enough on its own. That is not complete electrical safety training. So I've already covered it just naturally by going through the 70E requirements. So let's just look at an example agenda for electrical safety training. Talking about the statistics. It's a reality that people are still getting hurt and killed, so let's see it. Let's get real with it. Let's go into some stories and explain how that happened. And a lot of them, pretty much all of them, were event avoidable. So there was no reason for that person to be hurt or killed except that they were cutting a corner or they were put in a situation that they shouldn't have. What are the hazards? What PPE is required for those hazards? How far are those boundaries? And how do you read a warning label? How do you establish an electrically safe work condition? And that's usually a piece a lot of people have questions on, because guess what? Once that electrically safe work condition is in place, you can take off your PPE. And that's what people want. They don't want to have to wear their PPE the whole time, right? So that 8-step process, or really closer to 10 steps, that is something that I personally go into a lot of detail about. Make sure they get that right. Risk assessments and control, planning a job appropriately. When do you have to have an energized work permit versus is it just troubleshooting? Going into those details. What tools and meters should actually be in hand? Okay, looking at the ratings of those. And then surveying the knowledge, getting that feedback, making sure it's stuck at the end of the training, possibly even performing those audits. Okay, so whenever we talk about ARC Flash versus NFPA 70E training, well, 70E training is going to be compliant per Article 110.4. It's going to dive deeper. It's going to go into what's required and why. Not just how to do it, but what is actually required. Why? Where do we get that? Where did they decide to put that into the standard? How did this come about? What happens if you don't? All of that should be included in proper training. So real brief, auditing and improving your safety training. Review that content. Pull up 110.4. Compare it to what your training content actually covers, even if it's outsourced. Not all electrical safety trainings are necessarily going to cover all the topics you need. Again, depending on what your workers are doing. You can even get someone to help, someone who's considered a reliable and knowledgeable professional in this. You could even possibly call them an expert, like certified electrical safety compliance professionals, CESCPs. They've been proven through their education experience and testing that they know the 70E. That way they can provide feedback on that training and provide resources to improve the content. And a really good way, if you haven't already, is incorporating a mix of classroom and on-the-job training. So if you only ever do on-the-job, or if you only ever do classroom-based training, try to find ways to split that up or merge the two, or go back and forth and mix it up a little bit for qualified and unqualified workers, okay, for whatever topics make sense for their roles. Again, better understanding, higher retention for these life-saving work practices if you mix classroom and on-the-job training. All right, I've got one more poll question, really quick here. Now that we've covered our webinar today, giving an overview of what NFPA 70E actually talks about for electrical safety training, are you confident that your programs adequately cover the material required? How do you think your electrical safety training holds up? Do you have it covered? Is it good to go? Or do you think there's room for improvement? Just two options here, yes or no, and click submit. Nice, we got some confident people in this group, I love it. And for those of you who say that there's room for improvement, I applaud you for caring enough to be on a webinar like today's. Okay, don't stop though. Go back, read that information yourself, download those handouts, go to that website, herzigengineering.com/labels. Watch the toolbox talk. That's more of an arc flash training, mind you. And there's even a note on there that it's not full training, but it gets you started, if nothing else. All right. Fantastic. If you do need any help, of course, we can assist you. Our services do specialize in electrical safety and have for over 25 years at this point. So if you need an arc flash study done, if you need to look at safety training or programs, or you want a general audit and assessment of how are you doing, you don't even know where to begin, we can do those too. Infrared scans, equipment audit, all kinds of things, right? But here's the real goal. We got to understand what's required and why, so that we can achieve compliance, but more importantly, get your workers home safely. So at that, with only a couple minutes over the time allotted for our webinar today, I want to say super thank you for joining and engaging. Looks like we had a couple questions come through, and I'm going to skim through those. It looks like I might have already answered them in the course of the content today. But if anybody has any follow-up or additional questions they would like further clarification, I'm going to hang out for a while. I'm not in any big rush today, so feel free to submit it in the question feature, or you can call the office, ask for Caitlyn. I'm the only Caitlyn here, or you can email me. My email's right there for you. So thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate your time, and I hope that this is helpful in getting your electrical safety trainings a step closer to actually keeping people safe. Again, quick reminder here, go to that handouts tab, download them, use it as a reference, and use the question feature if you have any follow-up comments, questions, concerns, stories, feedback, anecdotes, jokes, anything. Starting off strong with a question from Brandon here, and I have to admit I had to look something up real quick. He says, I work at a hospital. My question is arc flash a requirement through CMS through NFPA 70E? I will say hospitals are required to have arc flash studies and safety programs and the whole 9 yards. They have the potential of electrical hazards just like any other workplace. So yes, they are covered by the NFPA 70E, and I had to look up what the CMS is, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I don't know if they enforce that. I definitely would be curious to look into it. But yes, 70E does cover hospitals as well. Good question. Oh yes, Jonathan, good point. We are hosting a free 4-hour training at our office on August 1st, and I am glad that you're signed up. So yeah, if you're interested, go to our website and go to our free training tab. that's where this webinar was also available to sign up, and you'll see free 4-hour training at our office in Kansas City. Anybody can come, just sign up so that we know you're on the way, because we are providing lunch as well. So you get free training and free lunch, plus you get to spend the day with me. No, I'm just kidding. It'll be great. It'll be a great time. I'm looking forward to it, Jonathan. Aaron, thanks for the feedback. I appreciate it. Be careful asking for jokes. That's why I screen them, though. You know, it can be for my pleasure without having to read it off on a live webinar. Bonus points if it's electrical safety related or electrical work related. So there's a challenge for my repeat attendees. By next webinar, I hope to see some either electrical safety or electrical work related jokes. Let's see if you guys remember. What do you call a bad electrician? A shock absorber. Yeah, that's right on the nose right there. Shock absorber. What do electricians call a power outage? I don't know, Jonathan. What do electricians call a power outage? Other than a brownout or a blackout. Barry, thanks for tuning in from Canada. That's awesome. Come on, Jonathan, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What do electricians call a current event? Ha ha ha. Oh, that's a real knee slapper there. Oh my goodness, you guys. Well, this could go on forever, so how's about we save a couple for next round, and I'm gonna go ahead and hide in the background a little bit unless anybody else has questions or comments that they would like to go back on, but thank you for entertaining me this afternoon, guys. I hope you have a great rest of your week.